Joan of Arc, Part 1, Scene 4, Take 1412. Action.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the History and Mystery channel. I'm your host, Sir Chronicler, and I would like you to like and subscribe. Now that you've done that, I want to delve into Part 1 of this two-parted series about Joan of Arc. Today, in Part 1, we will summarize her life story, and next week, in Part 2, we will delve into the conspiracy theories that are surrounding her legacy. But first, let us start with our 5 main questions for this episode. Who was Joan of Arc? What did her visions tell her? How did she create a turning point in the 100-Year War? Why did a group of French nobles betray her? And how did her life end? So, who was Joan of Arc? Joan of Arc was a French woman that was born in the year 1412 during the 100-Year War between England and France. To make it even more complicated, France was also split into a civil war between the Armagnac and the pro-English Burgundians. This war would give Joan a place in the history books and define her life story. This war would also make her a national hero of France and give her the name the Virgin of Orléans. She received this name because Joan would become a key figure in the siege of Orléans. And when Joan was not busy with leading men into battle, she would assist Charles VII of France during his coronation and make sure that he would officially become the King of France. But before we delve into that, we have to go back to the beginning. Joan got born in the year 1412, but the exact date is not known. What is known is that Joan was born into a peasant family in a town known as Domremy in the northeast of France. During her childhood and puberty, Joan didn't do many exciting things. She was a strict religious girl that spent her time studying Christianity. Probably the only 2 rebellious things she did was visiting different churches without her parents knowing and refusing a marriage proposal. When the year 1428 came, Joan was a 16-year-old girl that started receiving visions. She claimed that these visions were God-given, that she had to talk to the future king-to-be Charles VII. Charles VII was not yet officially the King of France at the time, because he still had to do his coronation. After that, he could officially proclaim himself as the King of France. Joan claimed to have received a vision orchestrated by God and the Archangel Michael. But what did her visions tell her? These visions told her that she had to save France from the English domination. She had to bring freedom back to the French people and make sure that Charles VII would have his coronation. Joan was a deeply religious devotee and didn't want anything to do with this war or the politics of the time. She even said, and I quote, "I would rather be torn into pieces by wild horses than leave the village of Domremy," end quote. Even though she wasn't interested in leaving, her visions kept telling her to do so. This put Joan in a difficult situation, because as a religious devotee as she was, she had to follow God, so she couldn't ignore her God-given task. So she had to put her personal feelings aside. During the heart of winter, Joan prepared herself for a journey that would start in February 1429. The first step of her journey would be reaching Charles VII's castle. During her journey, she would accompany herself with a small escort of 6 men that got assigned by a duke who was impressed by her story. During her travels, Joan dressed up as a man, because in those times it was much safer to be a man traveling through the country than a woman. This is a habit she would continue throughout her life. Joan and her fellowship also decided that it was much smarter to travel at night to avoid detection by English soldiers and their French allies. After traveling 11 stressful days, Joan and her fellowship arrived in Chinon, France. Now it was time for her second step, which would be a much more difficult step, because now she had to convince Charles VII of her vision and divine prophecy. But thank God, the Lord sent her a message through one of her visions. In his vision, she received a message that only Charles VII would know. After arriving in Charles's court, Joan first praised Charles publicly and then spoke with him privately. To this day, we don't know exactly what Joan told to Charles VII in the private conversation they had. But according to a witness, she told Charles a secret that only God could know. After hearing this, Charles was convinced by Joan, her story, and divine visions. Joan and her fellowship got welcomed into Charles's circle and they started preparing for the next step, the liberation of Orléans. But there was only one other small problem. A liberation would mean a battle, and Joan did not have any armor, and female armor wasn't something that was easy to find at the time. But luckily, with a little help, she would make a custom armor, an armor that was modified to the body of a woman and with a magnificent looking cape. Now that Joan was looking like a warrior icon for the French people, she had to become a warrior icon for the French people. And Charles VII would help her with that by accepting her into his army. This wouldn't be something that would get easily accepted by the other soldiers. Back then, the norm was simply only the men would fight in the army. But on the other side, if we have to be honest, they were all suffering from low morale and defeatism. Maybe bringing in a woman would be just the thing they needed. From the moment that Joan arrived into the military, she started making changes and introduced some new rules. One of those rules was that after they won a fight, nobody could plunder the place. If they wanted to liberate and unite France, they had to start acting like liberators and not like a bunch of raiders. This had a good impact on the people they liberated, and they started uniting behind Charles VII. Joan also demanded that the soldiers stopped swearing and started attending Mass every week. Thanks to her deeply devotion to God, she inspired the army again, and the people started to feel like they were waging a holy war and that God was on their side. Now that she managed to get an army that was energized and hopeful again, it was time to move to the next big step of the plan. It was time to liberate Orléans. By the end of 1429, Charles's army, under the leadership of Joan, would reach Orléans. When they arrived, they would see a city that had been besieged by the English and their allies since October 1428 and was in deep need of supplies and motivation. Bringing in the supplies would be the first priority of Joan. She had to motivate the people inside the city walls, and she did this by setting up a smuggling network to bring the supplies into the city. This action would motivate the people of Orléans to rise up against the occupiers. Now that a full-blown revolt started inside the city, the English and their allies got distracted. The distraction would give the French army the perfect momentum to attack the English army and their allies. Several battles broke out inside the city and around the city. It became a bloody fight against the battle-hardened English, but Joan would inspire the French soldiers to keep going, and even after she got hit by an arrow, she wouldn't leave the battlefield. Joan stayed with the men on the front line, and on May 8th, the English army started fleeing away from the battlefield. Now that the English army was retreating, Charles VII could finally claim a great victory for the French army, and let's not forget the liberation of Orléans. For her heroic actions during the siege of Orléans, Joan earned the honored name as the defender of the French nation, or better known, the Virgin of Orléans. Now that Orléans was liberated, it was time for an even bigger step, making sure that Charles VII would go to his coronation. For his coronation, they had to travel deep into English territory, to the city named Reims. During their travels to Reims, they liberated the Loire River Valley, captured surrendering English garrison in Bouillon-Sea, and destroyed the English army at Patay. Now that the road to Reims was clear, it was time for the coronation of Charles VII. Finally, after a long journey, Joan of Arc, Charles VII, and their army arrived in Reims on July the 16th in the year 1429. The next day, in a local cathedral, Charles VII got officially crowned as the King of France. Now that she completed everything that her vision told her to do, Joan took some rest from battle and accompanied the king during his peace negotiations with the English. But it became fast known that the English would never accept a long-lasting peace. After realizing this, Joan prepared herself again for battle and saw the liberation of Paris as her next target. It was an ambitious move, and just like in Orléans, she needed the locals to revolt against their English occupiers. Only this time it would be different. The Parisians didn't revolt, and Joan wouldn't get her momentum in battle. After her plan failed, Joan admitted that she never received the divine message to liberate Paris, For some, this would explain why it wasn't a success, but others started to wonder if she ever received a divine message, or that everything was nothing more than pure luck and charisma. Some people even started to see her as unpredictable and chaotic. Now that the French were losing again and Joan, her vision stopped. King Charles VII stopped with listening to Joan and started to focus again on peace talks. Now that Joan lost her military support from the king, she went rogue and gathered a group of her followers to capture the small town of Compiègne. On May the 23 in the year 1430, Joan accompanied an Armagnac force in the Battle of Margny, where an English aligned Burgundian camp was settled. Joan lost the battle and agreed to surrender to a Burgundian French nobleman. Joan tried to escape her captors 2 times, but failed miserably. Now that the English know that Joan was captured by one of their allies, they started negotiating with them for Joan. They struck a deal and the English paid the Burgundians 10,000 livres tournois. Now that Joan was taken by the English put her on trial for heresy in a religious court. She was accused of having blasphemed by dressing up like a man, acting upon visions that were demonic, and for refusing to give up her sword and deeds to the church, because she claimed only God could judge her and no one else. Her trial was politically motivated, and the English would never let her go unpunished. Joan got sentenced to death and would be burned alive. When a person gets sentenced to death, the executioner is responsible for making sure that the person that is sentenced to death doesn't suffer for too long. When it came to the execution of Joan of Arc, this did not happen. The scaffold was way too high, which would prevent the executioner to save her from suffering by giving her a quicker death. Joan probably died from smoke inhalation, which is a slow and painful death. To assure to everybody that Joan was dead, the executioner showed her bodily remains to the crowd. It is even said that they burned her bodily remains 2 more times. When there was nothing left besides some ashes, the English threw her remains into the river so that nobody could find it and use it as something to worship. What makes her death even more sad is that King Charles VII, who owed so much to Joan, didn't do anything to save her. He didn't even try to negotiate a deal. Saving Joan of Arc was of no political interest to King Charles VII, so he just did nothing and let it happen. On April the 18th, 1909, Pope Pius X beatified Joan of Arc, which basically means that the Catholic Church recognized her entrance into heaven. And on the 16th of May 1920, Pope Benedict XV officially canonized Joan of Arc. This means that the Catholic Church officially made her a saint. If you like this story and are interested in more information about Joan of Arc, then I would highly recommend you to check out our episode for next week. In that episode, we will talk about the conspiracy theories that are surrounding her life story. Like, did she fake her death? Was she a witch? And was Joan of Arc secretly a noblewoman that got hidden away from the public? These are just 3 out of the 5 conspiracy theories we're going to talk about. I want to thank you all for listening. See you in the next one. And remember, history is written in mystery.